Well, good afternoon again and welcome. I'm so pleased to be here today. I am certainly not Bruce Kane, the faculty director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. My name is Preeti Hehmeyer. I'm the associate director, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. Like so many people across the American West, Bruce is battling a power outage, and he sends his regrets. So I will do my best to step into his big shoes. Again, our program this afternoon is the first one of the new academic year at Stanford, one unlike any other before it. And we're so delighted that our first program is talking about the world that we're living in and grounding it in a contemporary history of the American West in the Virocene, which was a new word for me. And I'm so grateful that Professor Siegel will be able to walk us through it. Our moderator today is the distinguished Phil Polakoff, who is a dear friend of the Bill Lane Center. Phil is a true Renaissance man and really launched the Lane Center's work on health and healthcare in the rural American West in 2017. His professional background spans agriculture, engineering, medicine, and public health. He is an affiliated scholar with the Lane Center, a consulting professor at the School of Medicine, and the founder of A Healthier We, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing critical issues in rural health. Next Tuesday, on September 15th, Phil will be hosting the Healthier Rural America event, and we will share those details with each of you in the chat, and I believe Phil will share a little bit more later in the program. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Bob Siegel, who is a professor at Stanford's Department of Microbiology and Immunology. He shares appointments at the Center for African Studies, the Master of Liberal Arts program, and the program in Human Biology, as well as the Woods Institute for the Environment. Bob has been teaching about viruses for over 4 decades and has so much for our audience today. Now, before I turn it over to Bob, just some housekeeping. Our program today is being recorded, and you will receive a link in your email next week. Our format will be our standard format, where we will have opening remarks by Professor Siegel. Phil will start moderated Q&A after about 20 minutes, so around 2:25, and then we really do hope to take questions from the audience and make this as engaging as possible. So we do encourage you to use the Q&A function in the webinar at the bottom menu on your screen. Now, Bob, Phil, and I share a very special connection. We've spent many miles together on foot, and I am so pleased to turn it over to Bob to tell you a little bit more about his ties to the Lane Center. Thanks, and welcome again.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go directly and try to share my screen. See if we can do this, and then let's see. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking at the list. I'm a little bit daunted by everybody that's on the list, friends and family and things like that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a contemporary history of the American West in the Virocene. My Bill Lane connection, so you heard a little bit about. I had heard for basically two years ago, I went on this hike called Stanford to the Sea. And I actually had heard about an event called Walking the Farm for a number of years. And I always thought that would be really cool to go on it. I believe it's the brainchild of David Kennedy. I was telling one of my students about it, Devin Zander, and she actually contacted the Bill Lane Center and got permission to go on the walk. And I thought, heck, I can go on the walk too. So I contacted them, and so then we were all, this is in 2018, we all hiked through the woods. I got to meet a lot of amazing people. Here I am with Phil. Here I am with David. So we got to share dinner together. And then we finally made it to the sea. Here we are all pointing to Hawaii, I guess. So we're pointing west. One of the most salient features for me was my step count here, so 59,000. I should have just pushed it a little bit further. And then during the day, I kind of geeked out and was taking pictures and enjoying all the amazing things we were seeing, talking about nature. And this kind of resonated with Preeti, and she asked me if I would be a speaker the following year. So here I am being a speaker last year in 2019. And one of the other speakers was my good friend, Jeff Schwegman. And as a result of this, the Lane Center asked Jeff and I to teach a class on wilderness. Well, the coronavirus pandemic intervened, and that sort of brings us a bit to the present. Now, I do want to mention one other Bill Lane connection, at least one other, and that is that a lot of you have seen the logo for the Bill Lane Center, and some of you may even recognize this as Horseshoe Bend in the Colorado River. Well, it turns out I had taken my own picture a number of years ago of the bend, Horseshoe Bend in the Colorado River. So here's my picture. And by kind of a really remarkable coincidence, maybe, if we take the logo and we put my picture together, they match up perfectly. And so my goal here today is to fill in the rest of the picture. Talking about coronavirus. Okay, so here's a bit about me. I have a number of appointments at Stanford. So I asked the question, if somebody has an MD and a PhD, is that a paradox? I've been doing infectious disease for a long time. My chickenpox, if you want to get a hold of me, if my Gmail account is chickenpox@gmail, and my Skype is virusmanbob. So there's me. And as you can see, a lot of times I'll wear what I call attire satire. Today I have my my coronavirus bow tie on. I also have my Bill Lane Center hat on, so which I got for giving a talk for the center. So these are examples of my my attire satire from Infectious Wearables. So I've been in training for this for a very long time, and I'm gonna go and I'm gonna explain like what my background is a little bit later, since I build this as a personal history. But perhaps my greatest qualification is I got to hang out for a little while with Tony Fauci, and there I'm wearing my Ebola tie with my little HIV plushie. Okay, so and then one of my favorite cartoonists these days is Mark Tatulli, who does Leo. And so you can see here, Leo's father is reading a book, and this is a very scary story about coronavirus. And then the hero comes in to vanquish the coronavirus, and Leo goes to sleep. And you can see the book that's now the title, it's Captain Fauci versus the COVID creatures, part of the Leo fan fiction. Okay, so that's what we have here. Okay, so I want to deconstruct the title a little bit. I'm going to spend a bit of time on this. By way of background for this, I believe that crises have helped to clarify our views of different things, and put a sort of a lens on what we think about ourselves and about society. And so I'll be deconstructing the idea of history, contemporary history, what is the American West, and what is the Virocene. Okay, so as a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the American West, nor am I an expert on social inequity, although I am kind of an expert on infectious disease, and I do know a lot about the history of virology. Okay, so the pandemic as a lens sort of redefines what we think we know. It redefines what we thought we knew, and it helps us refine what we will view, how we will view the future. So we should think about this. And one of the things about the pandemic is deficiencies are amplified, inequities are amplified. Crises don't exist in an isolation, as we've seen. They seem to be piling up. I heard somebody say this morning, when are the locusts coming? And of course, tomorrow is 9/11. Another thing we've learned is that we don't learn much from the past, because we knew a pandemic was coming, and this has still happened to us. We are also pathologically divided, and I meant that sort of in both in terms of disease and also in terms of the severe nature of the division. And infectious disease are not blind to demography. Policy without accurate data becomes dangerous, and that's a point I will essentially end on. Now, talking about the pandemic as a lens, I've got an email, I think yesterday, the day before, from one of my former students who says, curiously, recent conversations with friends seem slanted toward the thinking that most of us don't really want to go back exactly to how we lived before the virus started. All of this time at home has led to meaningful introspection, forcing us to evaluate how we live and what matters most. I'll bet that families everywhere have made changes to their lifestyle that are for the better. And so I like to see, examples where people are actually focusing on lessons that we have learned and how we can better ourselves. So in the Q&A, you can think about questions about viruses, which I'm more than happy to answer, but also feel free to stick in your revelations and your silver linings. Okay, so my youngest son was visiting, and he said at one point that he thinks of 2020 as the year of the lung. And by that, he's talking about things like COVID and Black Lives Matter and wildfires and air quality, you know, the idea of I can't breathe. And we might throw in to that as well, the sweltering heat and also politics and psychological stressors that sort of keep us from breathing. So we might think of the PR campaign for 2020, it'll take your breath away. Now, last night I had a dream, and this is actually a real dream, and I'm certainly no Martin Luther King, and this may be loosely relevant, but I thought I'd talk about it. It'll give you guys something to think about in terms of my psychological profile. Anyway, so I had a dream that I was actually had dropped a camera card, an SD card, into a body of water, and I needed to go into that body of water. So I actually went into the body of water and was looking for the card, and I noticed that a song was playing. And it turns out this song was popular when I was in junior high school. I really haven't thought about it very much. And it's actually, you might recognize it. So I actually printed out some of the words to the song, which I think might be relevant. And this is a song from the Spencer Davis Group. So, well, my temperature is rising, got my feet on the floor, crazy people rocking because they want some more. Let me in, baby, I don't know what you got, but you better take it easy because this place is hot. You better take it easy because the place is on fire. Been a hard day and I had no work to do. Wait a minute, baby, this could happen to you. Been a hard day, nothing went too good. Now I'm gonna relax, buddy, everybody should. So this is from Give Me Some Lovin' by Stevie Winwood. It says in quote Stevie Winwood because it was actually, he's given credit, but there were several people who helped him with the song. Okay, so let's get back to the subject of contemporary history. Again, with apologies to historians. So contemporary history, we all have this interesting idea right now of our historical significance. So for instance, this year when people graduated, it was unlike any other graduation year. So we're going through a lot of challenging times, but we know that there's something unusual about these days. But we can ask the question, which is historians often do, can we actually make sense of the present in the present? And I think most people would say, no, we probably can't. But we can also ask, is the contemporary record that we're recording very biased in terms of the emphasis on various things such as the pandemic? Now, in terms of the American West, and again, with perspective of the virus, we can ask, is there really a unified entity? Most of us feel that there's regional differences in lifestyles and attitudes, but virus as a lens is, there's certain other things that we should keep in mind. One is that it's putting states in competition, even Western states. Secondly, it's creating a balkanization of response that don't actually necessarily correspond to statehood or even regionhood. And then there's also a factor of homogenization, which also sort of blurs the line of what the American West might be. So let's take a look at some of these things. The balkanization of response includes the questions of who gets COVID, who dies of COVID, who complies with public health measures, and who can comply with public health measures based on their situations. So in terms of living situations, it's one of the things that balkanizes us. We differ greatly in terms of, do we live in a nursing home or communal living, homeless situation, or reservations, such as the Native American reservations. We differ in our economic status. We differ in population density based on whether we live in urban, suburban, or rural. We differ in the states in terms of, and even locally in terms of governance, political orientation, access to medicine and technology. Our living, okay. So there's an example of some of the differences in politics, which may help to define the differences between the West and other places. And this is a map of the COVID. You can see that there's some correlations between where we live, but there's also some correlations into what people's politics are. And in some cases, we're more aligned with coastal values, okay? Some of the other homogenization factors that may blur the line of what the American West are is travel, commerce, and media. Okay, so now I want to define what the Virocene is. And so the reason why Preeti hadn't heard that word before is because I made it up. And I made it up to be analogous to the Anthropocene. And many of you have heard about the Anthropocene, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I wanted to use the Virocene rather than something like the Covidocene. And it turns out that the Virocene is actually evident in the geological record. In fact, even the era of COVID is briefly distinguishable, because when we first sheltered in place, the amount of pollution went down. There were just the ecological presence of certain animals changed. But we also want to mention that the Virocene is part and parcel of what we now consider the Anthropocene, and I'll expand on that. So the Anthropocene is may be defined as related to or denoting the current geological age, viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And that's only within the last few hundred years. And one of the things that people point out is that if you didn't know anything about the world, you could see that there was a distinct signature in the geological record in terms of the chemicals, in terms of the animals, in terms of extinctions and things like that. So I mentioned that I would cover the Virocene past, present, and future. So let's start with the past. I want to begin with a great historian, William McNeill, and he became famous originally for actually writing about the West. He wrote a book called The Rise of the West, and here he was looking at the impact between civilizations, and but then more recently, 2 decades later, he wrote a book called Plagues and Peoples, which is particularly relevant to the Virocene, and he offered a radical new interpretation of the extraordinary impact of infectious disease on cultures as a means of enemy attack. Okay, here's his book, and one of the quotes from the book is that ingenuity, knowledge, and organization alter, but cannot cancel humanity's vulnerability to invasion by parasitic forms of life. Infectious disease, which antedated the emergence of humankind, will last as long as humanity itself, and will surely remain, as it has been hitherto, one of the fundamental parameters and determinants of human history. So this came out in 1976 when I was just finishing college, and it basically changed the way we think about history to realize the profound impact on human history that diseases have had. So to summarize this, I would say that insofar as the Anthropocene defines a new epoch, its existence has been largely facilitated by the spread of infectious disease. So the infectious disease actually defines the Anthropocene. Now, another person who's talked a bit about these, and although William McNeill and Jared Diamond, you didn't necessarily see eye to eye on things, is the book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And again, talking about the importance of germs in terms of conquest and in terms of the sort of westernization of the entire world. Here's a quote from Jared Diamond, who states that the importance of lethal microbes in human history is well illustrated by European conquest and depopulation of the New World. Far more than Native Americans died in bed from Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefields from Eurasian guns and swords. These germs undermine Indian resistance by killing most Indians and leaving their leaders, and by sapping the survivors' morale. So this is sort of a quote that seems to be directly out of William McNeill's style thinking. These factors that both McNeill and Diamond talk about are very true in the West, just as they are throughout the Western Hemisphere. Now, one of the things about the history and thinking about the entire Virocene is that there are a lot of comparisons that can be drawn, and comparisons can be very helpful, but they can also be very misleading. And I just want to point out to everybody that over and over again, we're seeing comparisons to flu. And I just want to everybody keep in mind that SARS-CoV-2 is not flu, and SARS-CoV-2 is actually not, that should say SARS-CoV-1. So SARS-CoV-2 is actually not SARS-CoV-1 either. They're quite different in a number of ways. But you also should be aware that in perspective, the current pandemic is not the biggest, it's not the worst, and nor is it the deadliest pandemic that we've seen even in recent times. So I tried to get my students to think like a virus and realize that viruses are really honed for replication, and each one of them is honed in its own particular ways, but that viruses are quite oblivious to pronouncements by politicians or policymakers or philosophers or people in general. Okay, so you've probably read hundreds or thousands of articles now about viruses, and you've probably read tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of words about viruses, but I'm really kind of curious to know how much people really know about virology, about what a virus actually is. So I'm not going to give you a virus course, but just for example, because my regular virus course takes 120 hours, but for example, here's some of the key properties of viruses. They're extremely small. They're so small that they're much smaller than the cells that make up all living things, and that's called the cell doctrine. They have to go inside cells and take them over. They have an extracellular phase in which they're completely inert, and an intracellular phase in which they're dynamic and they take over the cell. They have a single kind of genetic information, either DNA or RNA, but not both. And all living things have both DNA and RNA, but viruses do not. They have a protective protein coat called a capsid. They can't make energy like all living things can. They can't synthesize protein, which are the main machines and structures that are found in cells and in living things. They have no means of movement, either internally or externally, like living things do. And they do things in a very simple way. They put an emphasis on biological economy. Now, also, you've heard about coronaviruses and how many people actually know the difference between a coronavirus and a regular virus. And again, this is a subject that, given how much we've read, I feel like people should have a better understanding of what it is that is actually a coronavirus. And again, that would help you realize that coronavirus is not flu. So briefly stated, there's a whole bunch of different factors that determine what kind of virus it is. And we lump virus into families. And the determination of families determine whether or not the genetic material is either DNA or RNA, and what the nature of that genetic material is, what their shape is, whether they have multiple chromosomes or a single chromosome, and their mechanisms of gene expression. And so we can actually characterize the type of viruses that make up this family of viruses, the coronavirus family, and you can see it here. Again, these are actually unique things. And when we understand more about the particular nature of a virus, that gives us a handle on ways of stopping the infection. Okay, so these days, the elephant in the room always seems to be COVID, or perhaps it's the virus in the room and we have the bats that are spreading it here, so COVID too. So as you heard, I've been in training for this marathon for a very long time. And so I want to actually talk about a little bit timeline of my life, since this is a personal history. So I first started teaching about viruses in basically 40 years ago in a class about cancer and how various viruses actually cause cancer. I started teaching a class called Humans and Viruses in 1983. And I've been teaching that class ever since, and it's about to start next week again. And so various other classes. For 20 years, I actually ran the infectious disease curriculum for the medical school. And I've taught classes on all kinds of different viruses. And I want to focus on the last one, which is a class called Viruses in the News. By the way, these are some of my former students who are currently in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And these are people who are on the front lines in fighting the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, and actually one of my former students sent me, a couple of them sent me notes today. I didn't realize that today is Teacher Day, so happy Teacher's Day to everybody. You may not realize that that you actually go to the largest monument to infectious disease in the world, at least my students do, which is Stanford University. And it was actually named after Leland Stanford Jr., who died of an infectious disease, namely typhoid fever, which is caused by Salmonella enterica serovar typhi. Years later, I realized that I actually did my dissertation on the very bacteria that killed Leland Stanford. And I was looking at this and mutations in this particular type of bacteria. Many people don't realize that that the Grim Reaper is actually on the front of the main library. So here we see the Grim Reaper taking Persephone to the underworld. So many students have passed this every single day and never noticed it. Okay, now getting to the contemporary history, in the timeline, the outbreak, we first became aware of this when there was an announcement made the last day of 2019, and that's what led to the idea of COVID-19. So it only got one day of 2019, but that gave it its name. And I want to give a context of this class called Viruses in the News. So I started teaching this class for the fourth time a few days after this announcement was made. So, so on January 6th, the spring quarter came, and we followed the pandemic very closely right from the beginning. This is Jeanette Canary, and she made a model of coronavirus that she made crocheted, and you can see the RNA coming out of it and the large spike proteins. Now, I had first proposed this class in 2013, and then I started. I taught it for the first time in 2014, and in the interim was the worst Ebola outbreak in history. I proposed it again in 2015 and implemented it in 2016, and that led to the worst Zika outbreak. And so one of my former students and a speaker for the class, Taiho Chen, stated, "Hi, Bob, I'm in American Samoa as the initial CDC responder to assist with the Zika response." So this was during the second episode of class. And I mentioned that a couple years ago, I proposed the class at Ebola breakout, and this year I proposed the class for a second time, and now there's Zika. Coincidence? And his response was, "You need to stop proposing viruses in the news for a while, perhaps." Well, undaunted, I proposed it 2 years later, and that led to the second worst Ebola outbreak, and you know what happened after I proposed the class in 2019. Now, interestingly enough, I proposed to teach it in 2020, but it was canceled due to the pandemic, so maybe that canceled the pandemic as well. Whatever the next pandemic might have been. Okay, now we heard about the very first case of coronavirus in the U.S. on January the 21st, and that day the Fox News contacted me, and they wanted me to comment on the president's comments that that the epidemic was under control, or the situation was under control. And so the next morning, I was interviewed, and I said, "There's very little evidence that coronavirus epidemic is under control." And so yesterday we heard that the president knew that there was a pandemic going on and that was not under control. Well, it's pretty clear that he knew it from the first case that was present. So here's my interview on Fox News. It looks like I'm in front of the quad. I'm actually in a dark studio. Okay, so the next day they solicited an op-ed, and I wrote my first op-ed for Fox News on the 24th, and basically wrote what you need to know about this health threat. And I've continued to write a number of op-eds, both for Fox News and elsewhere throughout the pandemic, including, for instance, in March, saying that we actually need to start a unified effort to stop the pandemic. In my February 8th editorial, I mentioned that that we really need to think about the pandemic in short-term, middle-term, and long-term. So 2 days ago, I was asked by an interviewer, would you go to the movies now that they're going to be opened? And I said, when you go to the movies, you need to think about how you're going to feel about this in a few years. Will you regret not going to the movies in a few years if you don't go? Or if you happen to go and the small chance that you develop coronavirus, will you regret that? Okay, so for me, the decision is clear that if you look in the long term, the long time frame, that you'll make very different decisions. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time talking with the media about coronavirus. Let's see. Few little more data points. California issued its shelter-in-place orders in March. So here we have that. And more recently, they've issued their color-coded 4-tier system for reopening framework. Now, where do we stand? And this is a place that you should all know about, which is the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard, which gives you data on how many cases there are. And I'm actually going to go through this in backwards order, starting with July 15th. So you can see these are from different talks that I've given, and you can see how the total number of global cases and how the total number of US cases has increased over time. So by July 30th, we have 4.4 million cases in the US. By August 14th, we have 5.2 million cases. And as of yesterday, we have 6.5 million cases in the US. And this is actually taken from a site called Worldometers, which is actually slightly more up to date than the Johns Hopkins page are. And so what we've seen is that, as a conclusion, that the US has been an abject failure. There's been denial, lack of preparation, lack of a national plan, lack of a national response, poor implementation, inadequate equipment or supply chain. Now, we can ask ourselves, how has that been different in the West? Okay, do these factors also affect us out here? So when we talk about the future, the question is, where do we go from here? This is one of my other former students who had made a ceramic model of coronavirus. And so the immediate future is in our hands. And the critical factor is that we put the fire out. So if we were dealing with fires, we would not want to let them burn and just wait for some miracle cure later down the road or some preventative that we don't have in our hands now. We would not let them just burn. This is the San Francisco Chronicle from 2 days ago, or from September the 8th. It says that August was the deadliest month for virus counties. It was also the deadliest month for California as a whole. Okay, so what did we do in response to that? Well, this is actually, in response to that, we're starting to open everything up. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, well, I'll leave it to you. It is true that the rates have gone down for the last 2 weeks, but the question is, will September still be even more deadly? I like to follow the comics, and this is from Non Sequitur. So here's the 11th command: thou shalt not be stupid, just follow the science. And he says, well, I got my hands kind of full already, so how about we just stick with these? So I want to thank you. An epidemiologist, an ICU doctor, and a scientist walk into a bar. I'm just kidding, they know better. So in the long run, SARS-CoV-2 will be in the rearview mirror, even if it doesn't disappear. So how many of you have thought about HIV today? Okay, well, HIV is still very much present, and it's still killing many, many people. So in conclusion, I want to, we'll get to after the questions, but in case we don't get to the time for thank you, I want to thank the people who helped make this possible: Stephanie Burbank, Preeti Hehmeyer, Marco Martinez, Phil Polakoff, who you'll hear from shortly, Bruce Kane, who had technical problems, David Kennedy, and Devin Zander, who made this all possible, Jeff Schwegman, my fellow hikers, my many virus students, and of course, everybody who came today. And this will take us back to the Stevie Winwood song, which also includes a line, "I'm so glad you made it, so glad you made it." Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob. What a wonderful and a lot of content. We appreciate it. We'll try and jump in with some questions. Phil's going to start us off, and we're having some great questions come in through the Q&A. We encourage you to submit them through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Phil?
Thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this dynamic presentation. And it's really hard to follow Bob Siegel with the spirit that he puts out there. He really brings to the table spirit, hope, and energy. So kudos to you. The questions are numerous. So let's try to make them practical to start. So what have we actually learned that's refreshing going forward with some silver lining in all of this? How are we going to learn from the pandemic? What's the response? Where does science fit in? Where do politics fit in? And is there a golden lining for all on board today and going to the future, so we feel that a better day is on its way?
Well, Thank you for the question. I think it's an excellent question. I might, just for fun, I have a little thing about questions. And then I'll answer your question. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so I get all kinds of questions. I get amorphous questions. I get predictions of the future. This is one of those. I get, please comment on. I get, please explain. And I also get questions. Can you recommend? So here's some examples. So tell me about coronavirus. That's one of my not favorite questions because I say, well, do you have 100 hours for me? And then I get these, so when is this nightmare going to end question? So when will we have a vaccine? What do you think of the study that came out 5 minutes ago on my phone? I have trouble with that one as well. What is this? Why is it called coronavirus? What's unique to this group of viruses? What's so important about randomized controlled trials? Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. I guess I'm somewhat pessimistic. I'm pessimistic about how we're responding. The virus is the virus, and it does what viruses do. It replicates and tries to find new hosts. We actually have the ability to end this pandemic in a very short period of time if everybody engaged in behaviors that prevent transmission. But what we've seen so far is that our response to any sort of situation, we've gotten tired and we're not actually doing the things that we need to do to end this pandemic. So you have to keep in mind that many pandemics, such as SARS-CoV-1, were actually stopped just by behavioral interventions. There was never a vaccine, there was never a drug. And I think sort of all sitting around waiting for the vaccine is kind of a mistake. Now, you asked for some optimism. There's some amazing progress that's being made understanding the virus. There's amazing progress that's being made in developing a vaccine. It takes a long time to test those vaccines, unfortunately. But I think that the key thing that we need to do is we need to realize that we have in our hands the ability to put an end to this pandemic now.
Okay, thank you. And have you found anything that's unique about the American rural West vis-a-vis the rest of the country? You did talk about the social determinants. You did talk about the economic. We do know that there's a higher rate of COVID that's hit the elder people, the imprisoned people, the meatpacking people, and the Native American reservations. That we do know. The numbers are significant, and we also know that the health resources are more limited in rural America than they are in the urban America. So from your perspective, is there enough skill sets out there to take the solution that you put forth?
Yes, I do. I think we have the ability to stop it in every situation. The question about, for instance, I'm not an expert on the rural West per se, but if we think about the demographics and the ways that that things are divided up, for instance, the factors involved in the Navajo reservation led to a horrific explosion of disease in which the resources were inadequate, and they continue to be. Well, the solution to this problem is to provide the adequate resources and the education, and to give them the ability to use the public health interventions that we know about. So those are the things that we need to do. They were not in place, and the same thing is true with the communal living situations and nursing homes and things like that, because they always pose a risk. Now, right now, one of the risks is being posed by, for instance, communal living situations on college campuses. And people seem to be surprised that there's now huge outbreaks among college students, but it's not a surprise.
Let me go to a question that I know you're an authority and have strong opinions on, the definition of herd immunity. And where are we going with that? It's both political and it's also policy, and it breaks down to practicality issues. So where do we stand on the definition of herd immunity?
Well, first of all, to a certain extent, I'd like people to realize that there really isn't such a thing as herd immunity. And I was thinking about this. You might think of an analogy with a fire, because I think there's a lot of similarities. If we had a forest fire burning, at some point there wouldn't be enough fuel and the fire would burn itself out. Well, when that happened, there would still be some trees that were spared, okay? And it turns out that as the fuel was burning down, the trees that were standing, the probability that they would actually catch fire went lower and lower as more and more of the forest burned, okay? So the fact is that when the fire burned itself out, there were still trees that were left standing, okay? But that's the worst case scenario. But it turns out that there's nothing that really protects those remaining trees. If those remaining trees were all, say you had 90% of the forest burn, but the remaining 10% were all very, very close together, and a spark happened to hit that remaining 10%, the fire would still burn those trees down. So there's no real protection. So let's get back and put that analogy in place with the virus. What it says is that if we let the virus run its course, at some point, fewer and fewer susceptible people will be in the population, and some people may actually be protected by the fact that there's a lower and lower probability that they'll be exposed to an infected individual. So where herd immunity actually is meaningful is that if we have a vaccine and we vaccinate a certain percentage of the population, we may be able to protect certain people who don't get vaccinated because everybody around them will be protected. And that's useful for people, for instance, who can't get vaccinated due to they're immunocompromised, or they're too young, or they have an allergy to one of the components of the vaccine. So in that case, herd immunity can play an important part when it comes to campaigns for vaccination. But achieving herd immunity by letting a virus run its course is the worst case scenario. It basically means the maximum number of people, and it doesn't actually protect the remaining people if they're aggregated together. So I think that kind of gets to the point here. I do want to mention one other thing, and that is that the key to controlling coronavirus is to decrease the transmission rate. Decrease the probability that any single person that's infected will transmit it to another person. And there are lots of ways to do that. Those are things like wearing a mask. Those are things like virally distancing from other people. Those are things like getting vaccinated or having treatment or using PPE. Those are all ways to lower the transmission. And the goal is to lower the transmission to less than one person for every person that's infected. And if that happens, the infection will begin to start to wane, the pandemic, and the epidemic will begin to end. So we need to combine all these things together to lead to a lower and lower transmission rate until finally there are no more cases.
Thank you. And I do really want this to be interactive. So let me just comment for a second on what Preeti was talking about. You're all invited to a webinar that deals more with the texture of the rural America and the problems that are associated with all the economic issues and the public health issues. And it's on the website for the Bill Lane Center. So let's turn to, that's a short pitch. Welcome to come aboard. And we've been working on a healthier rural America a lot to try to make it a better place for one and all ages, all ethnicity, all genders, whatever else you want to say. It's almost like really crossing the continental divide in a meaningful way. Let's go through the questions. The only thing I would ask, Bob, is let's see how many we can get through with quick responses, because we do have a lot of questions, and I'd like to give everyone a chance to hear your response. You wanted to say something first?
Oh yeah, I just thought I would throw it back at you to do a little bit more about your, because you've thought deeply about the rural American West, and I know you have a paradigm for thinking about that. You might just mention that briefly.
Well, I would just wrap it up real quickly with the 5 Ps, becoming more collaborative and interactive. We have to deal with personal health, we have to deal with population health, we have to deal with public health, we have to deal with political will, and we have to deal with place, and we have to listen. It's really important, because for a person like me who has been a very talkative person, I get more out of listening to what people are saying and getting them engaged. So in essence, how do we get from where we're at now, which is poverty and illness, to prosperity and health? And that's really a challenge. And it's going to take one last quote, which I think is relevant. How do we go from blue or red and vice versa to past the future? Because we really have to come up with a new way to change our society into a more engaging, efficient, effective way. And the health delivery system across the board is open for meaningful change. But that's for another day when we pitch a little bit more. But let's go through some quick questions. In dry climates, do viruses die fast because they're most moist enveloped but dries quickly?
Each virus is different. Viruses that have an envelope, like coronaviruses, tend to dry up in dry climates, and so be less infectious.
Okay. Are infectious diseases a form of population control?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So it turns out that there's a misconception that things that actually lead to human misery, death, and destruction, infectious disease, and war can actually limit population. And it turns out that historically we found exactly the opposite. The greatest determinant of population growth is the birth rate. And what happens is that in places where there tends to be pandemics or wars or pestilence, the birth rate subsequently tends to go much, much higher and overshoot the population that there was before. So it turns out that it's a very ineffective means of population control.
Can a virus be manufactured?
Well, a virus can be manufactured in one sense. So for instance, polio, we know the entire sequence of polio, and we could actually create that sequence in the lab. We're not smart enough to design a brand new virus of a type that we've never seen before. So we can either design a virus that exists or we can tweak a virus that exists. So in that sense we can, but we're not smart enough to actually make a brand new virus that we've never seen.
Here's another one that's of interest. I saw this polls too, that about 40% of the population would take the vaccine today if it was said it was legitimate and ethical and all tested. 30% said they would think about it. And there's a good chunk of the population, about 25%, said they would never take the vaccine. Any thoughts on what you have to do on this COVID-19 to make sure that we're on top of it?
Oh, so great question. So vaccination seems to be the question of the day. I think the critical thing here is it's not so important to think about right now whether people would take the vaccine or not. The most critical thing at this point is to make sure the vaccine is absolutely safe and effective. So it doesn't have to be 100% safe and it doesn't have to be 100% effective, but it has to be rather effective, probably at least 50%, and it has to be quite safe because many people are going to take it who wouldn't ordinarily get infected. So we have a very high threshold for safety and a fairly high threshold for efficacy, and that's the thing that matters. And once we find a vaccine that is safe and efficacious, people will be eager to take it, okay, regardless of what they say now.
Do you have any thoughts on the way Sweden approached the problem, which is very significantly different than how other countries made sure that they were sheltered down and they were more open-ended?
Yeah, they were letting the fire burn and they paid the consequences for it, and they're no longer doing that.
Okay, let's move forward. Boy, you got a lot of questions. Also, let me be totally transparent. You're getting a lot of strokes for your presentation. People say, make sure you tell Bob how terrific he is. So I don't want you to feel
Don't.
One or two say, well, wait a second. Does he listen? But that's another issue. What is better therapy that reduces the lethality or a vaccine? Is there anything that can deal with the treatment of the disease, or does the vaccine really prevent you from getting to that stage?
Okay, so they serve fairly different purposes. The vaccine is a way of decreasing the transmission rate and trying to drive that transmission rate closer and closer to zero. Okay, we want to decrease the total number of infections. Drugs are used to treat people after they've been infected, but one thing we learned that was kind of it's obvious in retrospect, but nobody predicted ahead of time, and that is that for HIV, the drugs that are used to treat HIV are the most effective way to prevent the transmission of HIV. So it turns out that drugs can also be highly effective as preventive measures. And so we're not hearing as much about the development of novel and highly effective antivirals. There are a few out there, such as remdesivir, but that is actually a very effective strategy to be combined with all these other measures. It's important to know that we need to combine all these things together.
Excellent. Here's one that's always challenged me, this whole issue of testing. You've heard, what's the right test? Do you have one nostril? Do you have two nostrils? Do you use saliva? Do you have blood tests? Where do you get it? Who's to pay for it? So the whole field, you shouldn't be tested. Now you should be tested. There's really lack of honest transparency in what you should be doing as far as the testing.
Okay, well, we certain things we knew all along, but testing is one of the things that we actually had to learn certain things the hard way about the specifics of these tests, okay? And so there's absolutely no question that there's a vital role for testing in terms of diagnosis and in terms of screening and in terms of protecting the population. So there's a critical role for testing. What the best way to do that is still dynamic. So one proposal that's come out of Harvard, which is very interesting, is that it doesn't actually matter how good the test is, as long as it's pretty good, if we could do it cheaply and get the results really fast. So that way we could test lots of people over and over again. And if we miss some, they would be retested. So if we had, and such a test exists, it's this thing called the lateral flow assay, and it's like a pregnancy test. And if we could do a test for a couple pennies, and we wouldn't have to do an invasive, highly invasive swab, for instance, and we could get the results immediately, then that would be a game changer in terms of being able to follow people and isolate them before they became contagious. We might be able to pick up all these people. So that would be really useful. Antibody testing to see whether you're immune has turned out to be much less useful than we thought it would be.
So here's a critical question. Do you have an opinion regarding testing of sewage as a basis for closing or opening up society?
I think sewage is an important part of the puzzle, but only when the incidence of infection is fairly low. So for instance, if as a community, we think we've controlled the epidemic in, say, one of the communities in the Bay Area, and then we test the sewage and suddenly we get a positive signal, we know we need to be vigilant to look for where those cases are coming from, and try to get them before they're transmitted to other people. So sewage, it's not a means of contact tracing, and it's not a means of diagnosis, but it's an important piece of the puzzle in terms of monitoring the health of a population.
Okay, before I forget, I certainly would welcome you to be a part of the seminar next week on a Healthier Rural America on September 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So that's an invitation. I think we really have accomplished a great deal, and I do appreciate all the turnout, and I should share with you, over 100 people heard this presentation. So I'm very impressed by the interactivity of the Stanford and the extended world to make this happen. And I can tell you, there was many applause for how you presented. And there were one or two comments about your bow tie. They want to know if it's for sale and where they can get it. But leaving that, before we say thank you to one and all, Bob, you had a few marks that you would like to share with everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and have a few things to end with here. I will say that my bow tie is for sale in exchange for a sizable donation to an organization that can help stop coronavirus. Let's see if we can do this. And okay, so I've talked of infections and modes of attacking, of strategies clever and shrewd. Now, drawing conclusion where data is lacking, I conclude that it's time to conclude. So, outbreaks are stopped by efforts devoted, but I leave you this, if you care, some cautionary words which I think should be noted. Viruses are everywhere. So take care of that viral infection. Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody who helped put this on and for everybody who joined us today. And I will hang around if people have questions.
And let me turn it over to Preeti, and for you to close it out from a center perspective.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was really a wonderful and informative program. We are a few minutes before the hour, and I think we might have a chance to answer just a couple more questions. If you don't mind, Bob, would you be willing to take a couple more that have come in through the chat?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, well, I got one here. Do current testing methods measure how much of the virus each person has?
Yeah, so this is a very important concept, and that is that, so for certain viruses like HIV, the concentration of virus in the blood is correlated with how contagious you are. So the equivalent, because we don't measure virus in the blood for coronavirus, the equivalent is when we do PCR, we amplify up the virus, and we get this thing called a cycle threshold, and that's how many times we have to amplify it before we can actually detect it. And the cycle threshold is correlated with infectivity. So what we find is that if you have a very high cycle threshold, which means we had to amplify the virus up a lot before we detected it, there's very good evidence that you're no longer contagious. And why this is really, really important is that means that we could actually detect people before they're contagious or after they're contagious, and we could actually protect other people from getting infected.
Here's another challenging question. Does it make sense to put people who are already recovered from COVID in key positions that would help prevent chains of transmission? Would that be an effective tool for reducing transmission rates?
Okay, well, that's another great, these are all great questions. It turns out that we already have 2 documented cases of people who have been reinfected shortly after they've been infected. And we know this because we can actually sequence the virus that infects somebody and determine that the person has been infected with 2 different strains, 2 different sources of infection. In the first document, and there's probably many more, but there's 2 that are well documented. In the first case, the second infection was mild. It was basically asymptomatic. In the second case, the second infection was worse, okay? So right now, we can't know what will happen to people in 6 months when we're only, this far into the pandemic. So most people have been infected, in June, July, August. And so we don't know how they'll react in 6 months. So the answer is it would not be safe to actually put people back on the line to expose themselves. So everybody who's even had the infection or who gets vaccinated should continue to take all the public health measures to protect everybody else and themselves. Unfortunately, that's the case.
Okay, I think this is a very critical question to have a sense of humor. Could the pattern on your bow tie be made into a mask?
Yes.
I think everyone really does appreciate the work that you're doing. We certainly have heard that. They appreciate the technology that was put on. So I think keeping to the time, I think we're right on target to thank one and all, to say that this is a start, not the end. More dialogue has to be put forth and interactivity. So thank you, Preeti, and thank you, the center and its entire staff, for doing a great job. And you want to say one last thing?
Yes, so I just want to parrot the words of Michelle Barry, and her words are, one of the most important things regarding the pandemic is to vote on Election Day.
Okay.
Great ending message. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Bob. And we look forward to hosting you at the next Lane Center virtual event. Stay safe, everyone.